Daf Ayin Beis Amud Aleph will begin Ayin Aleph Amud Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. We learned previously, we brought down the Bryce of the Machlokes Reb Meir and the Rabbanon. If a person was mishtatif in a mavoi, or chaseres rather, were mishtatif in a mavoi, do they need separately Eruvin chaseres? Do we say that the mishtatif in the mavoi, and therefore that will serve as the heir for the chaseres as well? Or do we need independently separate Eruvin chaseres? Reb Meir says you do, and the Rabbanan say you don't. The Gemara is not going to bring a machlokes and to define more clearly what are the circumstances of that machlokes. They argue in the following. One of them says that if the shlit of mavois was with pas, with bread, where pas can be used is what's used for Eruvin chaseres as well. So one says that if the shlit of mavus was pas, everyone agrees. Reb Meir also agrees that that serves as Eruvin chaseres as well, because they're joined together with pas, which is used for Eruvin chaseres. There's no machlokes there. Ki pligi beyayin. The machlokes is only by wine. If wine, something other than pas, was used for the Eruvin, for the shlit of mavus rather. Meaning, so one holds that if pas was used for the shlit of mavus, pas helps for Eruvin chaseres, so you don't need a separate Eruv for the chaseres with pas. Even Reb Meir would agree with that. Everyone would agree with that. And as Rashi points out, and the other side of it is, the corollary of that is that if there was Eruvin chaseres, if they made Eruvin chaseres with pas, then you don't need separate shlit of mavus. Then you don't need a separate shlit of mavus for that. The machlokes is if the shlit of mavus was, if they made shlit of mavus with something other than pas, let's say yayin, where yayin doesn't help for Eruvin chaseres, Reb Meir says, therefore you need a separate Eruv for the chaseres. But the Rabbanan say, no, migay, that the yayin helps for the shlit of mavus, even though yayin does not help for the chaseres, but migay, since it helps for the shlit of mavus, it also takes effect for the chaseres. That's what one holds. The other one says, no. If it's with wine, everyone agrees that you need a separate Eruvin chaseres. So we don't say migay that it helps for the movi, it helps for the chaseres. Ki pligi b'pas. The machlokes is by pas when the shita was made with pas. Reb Meir says that even though the shita was made with pas, notwithstanding that, you need a separate Eruvin chaseres. It has to be done separately. And if the Eruvin chaseres was done with pas, it doesn't help for the shlit of mavus. The Rabbanan say, in that case, no. Where it was with pas, then we do say it helps one for the other. Meisei, I'll ask you a kasha. The Gemara is asking a kasha now on the Man Dalmer, who says that a shlit for wine does not help for the Eruvin chaseres. Meisei, the lashon of the Bryce is v'chachamim ma'imrim oy ma'arvim oy mishtatfim. The Chacham say you don't need both an Eruv and a shituv, either one or the other. So my love, what does it mean? Oy ma'arvin oy mishtatfim. My love, oy ma'arvin b'chaser b'pas. Does it not mean either you're ma'arvin the chaser of the pas, and that serves for both for the Eruvin chaseres and the shituv, oy mishtatfim b'movi v'yayin. Or you can make a shituv with a movi with yayin. I mean, since it doesn't qualify how you're mishtativ, and you can be mishtativ, you can make shituv mavois with yayin, doesn't therefore that imply that either you're ma'arvim b'chaser b'pas and it serves for both, or you're mishtatfim b'movi, even b'yayin, and it also helps for both. So it's not a kasha on the mandamer that says that for a shituv with yayin does not help for the chaseres. Amrav Gidol Marav, no, Hachi Kamar. Oy ma'arvim b'chatzer b'pas u'mutarim kan v'kan. Either you're ma'arvim with chatzer with pas, and it serves that it helps both for the chatzeres and for the movoi. Oy mishtatfim b'movi b'pas, or you're mishtatfim b'movi with pas u'mutarim kan v'kan. Meaning, just like the Eruv and the chatzers with pas just like the Erev and the Chazer is with Pas. So too, when it says Mishtafim, it also means something that's similar to that, which is Pas. So yes, if you're Mishtafim with a Movi with Pas, it's therefore Mutar Kan V'kan, but not with Yayin. Amar Yuram Rav Halacha Rav Meir, he says Halacha Rav Meir that the Eruv does not help for both. The Shituf does not rather help for the Eruv, the Chatzeres as well. You need a separate Shituf and a separate Eruv. Now Halacha is like Rav Meir. There's a Machlekes Rishonim. Does that mean on which side of Rav Meir, on the Akula Dike or the Chumra Dike? Do we say that the Halacha is like Rav Meir, and therefore if you Mishtatif B'Yayin, you need a separate Eruv Chatzeres, but if you Mishtatif with Pas, you don't? Or are we Machmir? Are we more Machmir, like the Ravid says, are we more Machmir, and we say that no, even if you're Mishtatif B'Pas, you need separate Eruv Chatzeres. So that's the Machlekes between the Ravid and the Baal HaMor. So Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav Halacha Rav Meir. Rav Huna says minig Rav Meir. He says it's not the halacha, but it's the minig, meaning you don't darshan publicly. You don't say psak halacha publicly that that's halacha, but privately you instruct people that way. Rav Yochanan says Nagu am Rav Meir. He said it's not the halacha at all. Halacha is like the chachamim, but Nagu is like Rav Meir, meaning so if people they were knowing that way, and if they follow that minig, that custom, we are not meicha. We do not object to it. Frektesis, what's their macha over here? What's the place for a macha? If they want to be machmer, they're machmer. That's not the halacha. If they want to be machmer, they're machmer. Tesis gives several terutzim. One teretz that he gives is that by being machmer like Rav Meir, you're making a separate erev and a separate shituf. You're making a separate bracha. So you might think that you're making a bracha in a tzricha and it should be aser. Nevertheless, we say no. There is a makom to be machmer, and if you're machmer, we're not meicha. Taisus doesn't give this following teretz, but perhaps we can also suggest that we might have thought that you make a macha, that you do protest it, because if the halach is like the chachamim, and people are knowing like Rav Meir, there might be issues of machzek yura. It looks like gaiva. It's machzek yura, so maybe you should think we would protest. Or you might think it's agudas. You're making machlekes. So therefore, you might have thought that we should be making macha. Nevertheless, we say no. That nagu, there is a malkum to be machmir, and it is not machzek yura, and it's not a question of agudas, because there is a valid position over here, a valid reason to be machmir. So the Mishnah states as follows: Chamish chaburas shishachsa betraklan and 5 chaburas that were in one mansion. Beis Shammai omrim erev l'chol chabur v'chabur. Beis Shammai says you have to have a separate erev for each group. Each group is viewed as a separate house, so just as separate houses, they need a separate erev. They have to be mishtatif separately in the erev. So too, each chabura. Beis Hillel says no, it's one erev for all of them. They don't need separate ones. It's erev echad lekulan. But moedim is manchim yisasim shuim b'chadorim. Oibaaliyah is, but their moeda Beis Hillel is moeda that when some of them are in separate rooms, or in some separate stories and upper stories, then shehem tzrichim erev l'chol chabura v'chabura. There they agree that they do need separate eruvim. For each group needs a separate chabura. So the machlekes is if they are not in separate rooms. So we'll see in the Gemara shortly what type of dividers are we talking about over here, that they're dividing in separate areas. But they're not in separate rooms, so they have these temporary type of dividers, which we'll see, define it shortly. Do we consider them to be in separate houses or not in separate houses? Do they, therefore, asr on each other? Can they carry from one compartment to another one without an erev? And if they want to carry into the chaser, they each have their own. Each compartment has a separate pesach to the chaser. In order to carry from their compartment to their room to the chaser, do they have to be mishtativ individually in the eruv chatzeres or not? As it comes out from the Paiskim, what we are discussing over here is that these are not permanent residences. because if they were permanent residences, they certainly would have to have separate Eruvin. And they're not short-term guests either. As the Bir Halacha says, we're talking where they're here for a period of at least 30 days, but they're not there permanently. And there's also temporary type of partitions. That's the question, that's the issue over here. Are they considered full-time or part-time? So that's the discussion. Are these considered, is this one house or separate houses? If they're permanent partitions, they're considered separate apartments, and they cannot carry from each other one to the other, and they can't carry into the chaser without an Eruv. If they are over full-time residents, they're considered separate compartments. If they're permanent partitions, they're separate compartments. We're talking where they're temporary type of partitions, and they're not permanent residences. Zok the Gemara, Amar of Nachman, Machlaikes b'Masipos. The Machlaikes in the Mishnah between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is talking about Masipos. What are Masipos? Taisus Basra says they're temporary partitions that are less than 10 Tvachim high. So we have the Machlaikes in the Mishnah. Do we consider these compartments to be separate houses or one? The Machlaikes of Nachman says that's b'Masipos, where these temporary type of partitions. That's where we have Machlaikes. That's where we say that Beis Hillel says that they're considered to be one house, not separate apartments. Avul mechitza asora, but if the mechitza is 10 high, 10 tefachim high, divra kol erev l'chol chabur v'chabura. If you have that high of a mechitza, of a partition, then both Beis Shammai, and Beis Hillel would agree that they're considered to be separate dwellings, separate apartments, and you need an erev for each one of them. That's one version. Another version is Amar of Nachman, af b'Masipos Machlaikes. Machlaikes is also with Masipos. Machlaikes is by a partition of 10 high, and also by Masipos. So, therefore, according to this version, Beis Hillel would say that they're considered to be one. They're not considered to be separate, even if the mechitza is 10 Tvachim high. Beis Hillel still says it's considered one. Beis Shammai says they're considered to be separate even if the partition is a Masipos, meaning in both cases, both Masipos or 10 Tvachim high, there's a Machlaikes. Beis Shammai says they're separate. Beis Hillel says they're considered as one. Now we have another version of the Machlaikes, Pligi Ba, Rabbi Chiva, Rav Shimon, Berebi. They have a different way of understanding the Machlaikes. Chad Amar, one says Machlaikes b'mechitzas hamagias l'tikra, that the Machlaikes is when the partitions reach the roof, reach the ceiling rather. That's when we have the Machlaikes. That's when we have a Machlaikes that Beis Shammai says that they're considered to be separate. Beis Hillel says that they're considered, even in that case, to be considered as one. Beis Shammai says they're separate. Av machitza shein magias l'tikra, but if they're machitza shein magias l'tikra, divra kol erev echad l'kulam. But if the partitions don't reach the ceiling, then everyone agrees, even Beis Shammai agrees, that it's one erev. They're not considered to be separate apartments. Says, if you're saying that the Machlaikes is where it reaches a tikkah, reaches a ceiling, well, in the Mishnah said, it says beferish in the Mishnah that if they're in separate, that they're moedim is much miksasim shuim b'chadorim abaliyas shehem strichim erev l'kol chabur v'chabur. When they're in chadorim and aliyas, then everyone agrees that they're considered separate. You need separate eruvin. So that's a case where the mechitzas are magias l'tikra, and Mishnah says that Beis Hillel is moedim. For Taisus, the answer is that what we're talking about over here is not fixed walls. We're not talking about permanent walls. We're talking about walls out of curtains. And Hanami, if you're talking about a stationary wall, a fixed wall that reaches the ceiling, everyone agrees that they would be considered to be separate apartments. You need an erev l'kol echad v'echad. What we're talking about over here is curtains that reach the ceiling. So Chad Amar says it's megias l'tikra. That's when there's a Machlaikes. There's curtains that reach the ceiling. That's a Machlaikes. Beis Shammai says even though they're curtains, but they reach the ceiling, they're considered separate. You need Erev L'Kol Echad V'Echad. Beis Hillel says, no, it's still considered to be temporary, and therefore Erev Echad L'Kulam. But if it's mechitza she'en megis l'tikra divrakol erev echad l'kulam, if it doesn't reach the tikra, the ceiling, everyone agrees that one erev is sufficient. The Chadamar, the other one, says machlekes from mechitza she'en megis l'tikra. No, the machlekes is where it doesn't reach the ceiling. That's where there's a machlekes. That's where we say that Beis Hillel says they're considered to be one erev echad l'kulam. Ava mechitzas hamagis l'tikra, but if they reach the ceiling, divrakol tzrichen erev l'kol chabur v'chabur, then everyone agrees that, even Beis Hillel agrees, you need a separate erev for each chabur, for each group.